So we're in stage 3, and I just want to revisit what we did early on in this course and take a look at the active ingredients and the stages together and see what we've done and where we are. So we did stage 1, which was if you look at the PowerPoint there, we did stage 1, the therapeutic relationship and positive expectancy. We've done stage 2 of teaching some skills, specifically was teaching our clients about their autonomic nervous system functioning and the ability to regulate that system. We've done some really nice cognitive restructuring and helping them to begin to have a little bit of self-compassion and begin to see themselves as resilient rather than afflicted. And what we've done also, as I talked about previously, is we've done a mid treatment. This is going to be somewhere 4, 5, 6 sessions into the treatment. We need to have a discussion with our client about their criterion B symptoms. If they are having flashbacks, nightmares, intrusions, being erupted upon by their past, of where the intrusions are so intense that they confront situations in their lives and they get triggered so intensely that the space collapses, and that they are immediately into compulsive aggression or avoidance, and they're breaching their integrity, they're acting in ways that they don't want to be, and they're finding that happening consistently. Then that starts to be evidence that we want to talk to our client about, explain why that's happening, that you have these traumas in the past that are intruding. What would you like to do about that? And I think it's really important that we give our client the choice that either to continue on as the way we're going and practice in vivo direct therapeutic exposure by confronting those triggers in their lives and dissipating the energy and lessening the intensity of the trauma, or do you want to go back and work through those? And as I said also earlier, up until 5 or maybe as long as 10, but not long years ago, that was just assumed that trauma treatment was you came to see a therapist and everything was organized around you were preparing your client and you knew that there was just never even any discussion about it. You were going back to the trauma memories and work through those. And it's exciting for me to be here in the 21st century and out on the vanguard. Before we finish this course, I'm going to talk to you about a book that I've written and a treatment of trauma that's all forward-facing, and how to implement that. It's kind of what we're doing anyway, but I want to formalize that and structure it for you. And the more that I've done that, the less I find myself going back. But still, with somewhere between 40 and 45% of my clients, is that I do end up going back at least once to one memory that is intruding with intensity. So what I want to do for the next hour or so is to help you to have some informed decision about what you want to do with your professional development. There's a lot of different ways to address those memories, and almost all of the trauma treatments are still organized around that. They're still organized around going back and working through the memories. And there's a lot of them. There's some that are really good and evidence-based. There are some that are showing some promise, and there's some that don't have much evidence. But that doesn't mean that they don't work. It just means that there hasn't been resources to do much research on them. So I want to kind of walk you through all that's out there that is in the literature that has some degree of research around it. I'm not going to do the completely experimental ones. There's a lot of stuff coming on right now. The virtual reality is being used a lot with combat trauma, and there's some promise there. There's a lot of drug therapies using oxytocin to confront memories, using MDMA, ecstasy to help combat veterans confront memories. There's just a lot of experimental stuff going on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of do a survey of trauma treatments with you and go through using the lens of the Veterans Administration, Department of Defense Guidelines for Treatment that was published in 2010, the Guidelines for the Treatment of PTSD. And what they did was a big meta-analysis, looked at the research, looked at the evidence, and then did consensus with professionals around the world, trauma therapists, to get both evidence and recommendations. And they stratified those into 5 categories: A, B, C, D, and I. A is good evidence and good recommendation. B is good and moderate or none of one of those. So it might be good evidence, but not any favorable recommendation, or it may be good recommendation with moderate evidence. C is some evidence but not enough to be convincing. D, category D, is, as I talked about benzodiazepines yesterday, is contraindicated, and that's the only thing that's in criterion D is benzodiazepines. And then category I is no information. So not enough information to make any kind of, no evidence, no recommendation. Doesn't mean it doesn't work, it just means that there's no evidence. So here's what those treatments look like. Here's what they are, is that we're going to look first at cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of down the middle. There's, cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of assumed. I remember back in the 90s, there was a lot of antagonism from the CBT camp towards EMDR. And what happened was EMDR just kept researching, and there kept being all of this evidence of EMDR's effectiveness. And I remember the first article that I read, I think it was in probably 2000 or 2001, where they came out that EMDR was a cognitive behavioral therapy. And I just kind of scratched my head. It was like there was just this antagonism, and then there was this other kind of, once the evidence reached threshold, they just kind of assumed EMDR and said EMDR is a CBT, and it sort of is. It's different, but it covers and satisfies a whole lot of the underpinning for cognitive behavioral therapy. So we're going to look at those first, and I'm going to kind of explore with you a little bit more thoroughly than any other eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, just because it's different than anything else, and there's a lot of good evidence for it. I'll talk to you about some hypnotic procedures and specifically some of the neurolinguistic programming techniques that were developed in the mid 90s, early 90s, that still have some good evidence and that work pretty well. A little bit about psychodynamic and a little bit about medication, and then going into the less research, talk about somatic experiencing, sensio-motor treatments. Specifically, I want to talk to you a little bit about Dave Briselli's trauma releasing exercises, and then all these other treatments that you see listed there. I won't go down the list, but I'll talk a little bit about each of them. But the first thing that I want to do is, we talk a lot. I know that I did this probably 5 years ago, was that we've heard, a lot of us, our whole career, have heard about, in the literature, you go to a workshop, you look at a brochure for professional education, and it all says cognitive behavioral therapy. And I realized about 5 years ago that I have had a lot of experience with cognitive behavioral therapy. I know what I think cognitive behavioral therapy was, but I didn't have an empirical definition of what CBT was. So I got on Google and I started researching it, and I found the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Institute, I think is what it's called, and kind of read through what the the professional organization for cognitive behavioral therapists, what they said is cognitive behavioral therapy. So I want to kind of start with that. I want to make sure you understand what are the ingredients, what are the components of cognitive behavioral therapy, so that when we talk about CBT, we know exactly what we're talking about. So first of all, identification of some of the luminaries in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy that have a place in the heritage of treatment of post-traumatic stress, and mentioned many of those already: Joseph Volpe, B.F. Skinner, Pavlov, even with classical conditioning, Aaron Beck, more on the cognitive end of the scale, Edna Foa, developer of prolonged exposure, Terrence Keane, who has been with the National Center for PTSD for probably 20 years and has been involved in a whole lot of the research, Donald Meichenbaum, Canadian, who developed stress inoculation training and has wrote, and I think it was in '94, the Handbook of the Treatment for PTSD, and it was a really important book, poorly indexed, but an excellent book. And finally, Patricia Resnick, who developed cognitive processing therapy. Those are some of the luminaries that have developed the CBT approach and evolved CBT for specifically for the treatment of post-traumatic stress. There's a whole lot of other people out there, but those are the ones that are kind of at the top of the heap. And what is CBT for trauma? What are some of the techniques, the flavors of CBT? Well, systematic desensitization, which was originally built for the treatment of phobias and fears by our granddaddy, Joseph Volpe, back in the 50s. And that continues to be one of the most utilized and recognized CBT approaches, techniques in the history of psychotherapy. Stress inoculation training, which is Donald Meichenbaum's, and I talked about that when I was discussing some of the material yesterday, specifically the way that thought field therapy and some of the tapping techniques can kind of do what SIT does in a whole lot more quick and self-help approach in doing it that way. Relaxation training, Herbert Benson's work at Harvard, and then that's evolved kind of more into the mindfulness-based stress reduction. A lot of mindfulness talk in the 21st century now. EMDR, direct therapeutic exposure, prolonged exposure, and cognitive processing therapy. Those are the big dogs of working with traumatic stress. So, National Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy .org, NACBT.org is the organization from where I got this information, and I just want to kind of walk through this quickly with you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want you to hear what the folks that are kind of the guardians of the guild of cognitive behavioral therapy, what they say cognitive behavioral therapy is. And first of all, CBT is based on the idea that thoughts produce emotions. And that you are always looking at what are the thoughts that are associated with the outcome, with both the emotions and the behavior. And the idea is that if you can adjust those thoughts and make them intentional instead of being reactive or procedural, that you can start to change the outcome in both in terms of the way the person's feeling and the outcomes of the behavior. That is an underpinning skeletal belief structure for folks that practice CBT. Key concept number 2 is that it's brief. I remember the first time I ever watched, this is back old school, for those of you old enough to remember beta tapes, I remember watching a beta tape of James Masterson when I had, I think, my first narcissistic client, and this would have been back in the early 90s, 92, 93, And I remember watching a video of James Masterson talking about treating narcissism, and I was watching. I think I was eating. I was watching it at home, and he said, and we're early in our treatment here. This is the 103rd session. And I was like, early in treatment at 103 sessions. So that's kind of that's 20th century psychotherapy, psychodynamic, that often would go on for multiple years of treatment, and that CBT has really driven the field, and especially with third-party payers becoming more and more, the past 25 years, it's been more and more and more, treatment has been attenuated to the third-party payers. So getting sessions down to as minimal, a lot of third-party payers is now 4 or 5 sessions is all they pay for. So, what can you do in 4 or 5 sessions that produce significant results? And that's been where CBT has excelled, is being able to get pretty good results in a short amount of time. The third concept is that, and I love this, is that I talked about it earlier, that a lot of times in the research, when you look at outcome studies with CBT, you don't hear very much mentioned about the therapeutic relationship. And I just appreciate that the National Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapists have made one of their 10 pillars is that it's essential to have a therapeutic relationship. Now, they go on to say that it is not the focus of treatment, which it is with us. Hopefully you've seen that there is a constant, with using feedback-informed therapy, there is a constant dialectic of working the relationship so that we have full engagement from our clients. And what cognitive behavioral therapy does is eschews that a little bit, because it's not a peer-to-peer. It is not essential with CBT to develop this collaborative process. It's more that the therapist becomes more into a teaching role than it is in a dual kind of collaborative process. And I'm sure I'll get some pushback on some CBT folks with that, because there is some folks that are doing CBT now, especially trauma-focused CBT, that is much more relational than is the traditional methods of cognitive behavioral therapy. That it is a collaborative effort, but again, there's collaborative from this perspective, which is, it's collaborative meaning that we have some degree of relationship, but there's never any doubt who is empowered in that relationship in cognitive behavioral therapy. It is the therapist. The therapist is the expert, and the therapist brings forward the teaching. The therapist is directive of the course of treatment. The therapist takes responsibility for bringing forward the agenda, for assigning the homework. That's all done with a power hierarchy. But paradoxically, we do, when you're practicing cognitive behavioral therapy, you're not doing it to the exclusion of your client. You're not treating them as a data input machine. You have to be engaging with them and hearing their story and beginning to perceive it from their perspective, so that you can begin to, one of the things about CBT is you got a whole menu of interventions. And you have to be in a collaborative relationship to start to select the interventions that will be most useful and most valuable in the course of your 5 or 8 sessions that you've got with your client. That the cognitive behavioral is based upon Stoic philosophy, which means rational thought. It is factually based. It's asking clients to confront their biases and to test out those biases in the world and see if they are true, instead of just the assumption A really nice one of that you saw me do, what would absolutely fit under cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoic philosophy, is, are you in danger right now? And the reality testing of that I did with you guys earlier on in this training, of where I said point out the danger, and we began to rationally tear that apart. That's the example of how you use Stoic philosophy, based upon rational thought rather than upon our learning history and our distorted perceptions that are a result of painful learning and fear. A really nice example of that. And continuing with the Greeks, that we also use Socratic questioning. And you've watched me use Socratic questioning as an engagement strategy in the training of this. Like, what do you think cognitive behavioral therapy is? That's a Socratic question, open-ended, and it's an engagement process. It is meant to elicit information, to pull it out here so that you and your client can begin to talk about those perceptions and those behaviors and begin to see which is effective and which is not. And the way you get that is that you ask these kind of innocuous, open-ended questions designed to get your client to bring forward information. Concept number 7 is that it is structured and directive, as opposed to a lot of the psychodynamic approaches is and the humanistic approaches, is that it's kind of that you deal with it as it emerges, as there's an organic kind of opening, and whatever comes forward, that's what you deal with in that session, and kind of build interventions around how the unpacking of that's happening organically with your client. Whereas cognitive behavioral therapy has an architecture, that there's a treatment plan, that there's a structure all the way through treatment. And this session I'm going to do this session I'm going to do that, and barring crisis, that's the way that the therapy is implemented. That one of the primary functions of a cognitive behavioral therapist is that they are an educator. That psychoeducation is probably the primary mechanism for change in CBT, is what would be an underpinned belief structure of cognitive behavioral therapy is that as people learn better, they do better. And teaching them different ways to think, different ways to perceive, different ways to behave, that process is an ongoing process. And if you're doing it elegantly and managing the relationship, then it is helping them to bring forward, unearth, externalize the way that they're perceiving themselves, the way they're perceiving the world, and then saying, how is that serving you? Dr. Phil, how's that working for you? That's cognitive behavioral therapy, for sure. Doing value judgments, helping your client to determine what it is they want to change and what they don't want to change. Concept number 9 is that we do the inductive method, which means we look at their assumptions, their data, and how their experiences in their lives. All drivers are jerks, and then showing them how that induction has turned into a perception of the world. That life is stressful. Let's go test that out. Is there any way that you can regulate your autonomic nervous system so that you're not experiencing stress while you are encountering those situations? Being able to look into the mechanism by which your client is ascribing meaning to the behaviors, their own behaviors, their thoughts, and other people's behaviors. It's specifically, this is important with relational, of the way that we see something that another person's doing and that we jump to because of our learning history, making evaluations about what's true for them. and kind of sit in a place of judgment, and beginning to question that, and to see meta, to see how we're jumping to conclusions is part of using the inductive method. And finally, what CBT does is it uses homework, that a lot of writing. If you've all you need to do is look at David Burns' his book Feeling Good. I don't know if any of you have known that. It's probably the best-selling self-help book that's ever been published, and there's just chock full of homework assignments, self-help methods that folks do. And probably the most famous of them is the triple column technique, of where the event, the meaning, and the behavior, and then being able to start to keep that log, so that you can bring that back, and your therapist talks with you about whether or not that's something you want to keep, or is that something you're interested in changing. So the collection of data, so that we can then change that, is also a big part of cognitive behavioral therapy. So those are the 10 kind of principles upon which all CBT is stacked. So now you know. And I'm sure I would also get some pushback on this, but I wanted to kind of look at what does trauma-focused CBT do. You look at cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, stress inoculation training, direct therapeutic exposure, all of those different CBT approaches. And here is the essence of what the trajectory of treatment looks like, is that we do assessment. We are doing a formalized assessment, and then we're doing an informal assessment. The formalized is with qualitative methods of using instruments, and CBT folks use the PCL a lot, the CAPS, the impact of events, to be able to get that data. But there's also qualitative data collection about interviewing our clients about the traumas of their past, and the way that those traumas are affecting them in the present. And then there's skills building, stabilization of teaching, some relaxation strategies. Mindfulness has become it's 20 years ago, I don't know that mindfulness would have been accepted by most CBT practitioners, but today it's a centerpiece of CBT treatment, of teaching mindfulness. And I can't remember if I said this or not in this particular course, but you notice that I've not mentioned mindfulness, and there's a reason for that. And good mindfulness that is of the Buddhist tradition it sits on two pillars. And what good mindfulness does is first step in good mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn mindfulness, is calm body, observant mind. And to be able to get a calm body, you have to do interoception, which means, when you think that through, you can't do mindfulness in the mind. That good mindfulness requires the development of that capacity for interoception. So there's good mindfulness and bad mindfulness. That good mindfulness rests on two pillars. John Kabat-Zinn mindfulness, the mindfulness of the Buddhist tradition, it's two principles that produce that mindfulness, and it is calm body and observant mind. And to get a calm body, what you have to do is be able to leave your mind and put your cursor of awareness in your body. You have to do that interoceptive process to monitor and scan, to do, I don't think I said this explicitly when we were doing the Tools for Hope stuff, but what interoception is is biofeedback without the apparatus, is that you're developing the awareness of your physiology so that in real time you can notice when you're in distress and you're constricted, and take that attention out of your mind, put it in your body, release the tension, and then with that you get back neocortex, and now you can be a superordinate and observant of your behavior and of your thoughts. Your ego can kind of be up here noticing and monitoring yourself, whereas when you allow that arousal to get too high, you lose those medial brain structures and you lose awareness of yourself. So mindfulness just requires that interoceptive process. And then other cognitive behavioral strategies, things like the psychoeducation and helping to restructure cognition specifically about self, to help with trauma survivors that come into treatment in that antagonistic relationship with themselves, and helping them to shift into some self-compassion and some honoring of their experiences. And then with all of that done, then there is the transition to moving into exposure-based. All CBT for trauma incorporates exposure. And some of them, prolonged exposure, puts a little bit more weight on direct therapeutic exposure of in vivo exposure, of going out into the world, where cognitive processing therapy puts a little bit more weight on in vivo exposure of working with the memory. They both do both, but there's a little bit of different flavoring of that. And I've already talked about this, but let me reiterate it. In vivo exposure is, if you'll remember from early on, from the very first capsule that I did on in this training, when I took the black portfolio and I whacked myself in the head with it, and I said that, that what I've done up until this moment here is that I have avoided, or with brute force confronted, the thing that I'm afraid of. At the moment that I begin to practice reciprocal inhibition, i.e. relaxed body, while I am confronting all of those things out there in the environment that are perceivedly threatening. Why do I perceive them as threat? Because I am being intruded upon by painful past learning. As I am able to confront the thing in the environment that I'm afraid of in a relaxed body, then I am healing that back there, here in real time. The more that I confront the things that I perceive as threatening in my present day, the less impact that those traumas of the past have upon me. So that's the forward facing, although it's not talked about that way in vivo exposure. That's what's happening, is that the more that I'm able to do in vivo, the less I have to do of memory processing. That's kind of a nice way to say that. And then finally, just kind of an analysis or a review of CBT. Positive, what's good about it is that it's brief, it's easily measured, it's clear, it's easy to implement. There's a lot of resources out there for both the clinician and things for clients to be able to utilize. It's relatively, because it is primarily technical, it means that it's easy to master, that you can take a workshop and learn the basics of CBT and begin to implement that straight away, and in short order have mastery with it. And it is there's lots of therapists that practice cognitive behavioral therapy, so it's easy for clients to access and utilize. What's negative about it? It can be especially folks who are relationally sensitive, who've been hurt a lot in relationships, that they can sometimes perceive the cognitive behavioral therapists' reliance on technical change of behavior and thoughts, and eschewing the relational issues of treatment to teach new things. That a lot of times clients feel a little bit slighted, uncomfortable, not heard, not appreciated, and that you'll get sometimes that folks will drop out of CBT because they don't feel appreciated and connected with the therapist. I've worked with a lot of clients who have come to me after having had a failed experience with doing cognitive behavioral therapy with somebody that's a CBT clinician, because they have not, and I've asked them if you've ever had therapy before and what worked and what didn't work. They appreciated the simplicity and the skills that they learned, but you know, that quote from Bill Glasser, that people don't much care how much I know until they know how much I care, is that relational process is the bridge by which I can have my clients teach them something. And sometimes I think the good CBT folks manage that well. I think they probably do it instinctually, intuitively. I think that a lot of people new to cognitive behavioral therapy put a lot more weight on getting the technical stuff right at the cost of the relationship, and that can end up damaging the outcome and the effectiveness of the treatment. And that it is, and all of those are kind of similar. It's therapist driven, that it's not client driven. And I think with the empowerment and resilience structure that you've seen me walk all the way through this stuff with you, is that we have continued to we've got these tasks to complete: build a therapeutic relationship, help them to restructure their cognitions, help them to regulate their autonomic nervous system, and help them to turn their traumatic experiences into language. Those are explicit and discrete tasks. But the way that we're doing that, because we're using a feedback informed process, we're going about that. Every single client's treatment's different. We're constantly attenuating to our client's way of receiving information in their relational style, so that we're preserving that and finding ways to teach and engage in these activities that fit with our client's relational and informational processing style. That's a little bit different. Still doing a lot of cognitive behavioral stuff, but it is built on a much more collaborative model. So, was that a stop?
Oh, I didn't know if it was or not.
Uh-huh.
I said I didn't know if it was or not. You can keep going right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just cut this out.
So let's get into the VA DoD's guidelines. It's about, I think it's 300, right at 300 pages. It's available. You can just check VA DoD guidelines for treatment and download that. It's free. It's on the internet. It's in a PDF, and you can look through that. The first 113 pages of it is it's kind of preparatory stuff, looking at risk factors and strength factors, resilient factors, things that are pre-traumatic, and what are what are risk factors, what are strength factors. Paratraumatic, what happens during the trauma that can predict more symptomatic or more resilience, better recovery, post-traumatic factors, how to do prevention, what are the best practices for the prevention of PTSD and the treatment of acute stress disorder, going into psychopharmacology. So there's a lot of stuff in there. Page 114 in the guidelines starts psychotherapy, and it goes into all of the aspects of psychotherapy, and then it looks at the evidence-based treatments. And these are the ones that the VA DoD have made Category A, the 4 big dogs. And those are cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, stress inoculation training, and other, and included in other is direct therapeutic exposure, trauma-focused CBT, and EMDR. So those are the 4 big dog criterion A's. So I want to go through those with you. And over the past year, there's kind of a cool thing that if you want to check it out, a really nice way to understand prolonged exposure is if you go to the App Store for either iTunes or for foot just got stuck in the stool here. iTunes or Android, they have a PE coach. So it's an app that walks you through and kind of structures the prolonged exposure treatment protocol, and kind of, here's first session, and here's the material, here's the homework, and it's got scales for the client. So it's kind of a cool way that you could see how what the process all the way through prolonged exposure might look like. And I'll see if I can do that in short order and just take you through briefly, give you a sampling of what prolonged exposure is. And as I wanted to make the point, and also on the VA/DoD's guidelines, the VA/DoD's website, www.ptsd.va.gov. There are, for all of the CBT approaches, there is nice literature, videos on all of them. So you can go to, when you go to that page, there is a navigational on the very splash page, and it says for clients and families, or for professionals. And when you click the professionals, it opens up to a page with a lot of menus that you can look at assessments. And if you look at treatments for PTSD, it will take you into all the resources of where to get training, and reading, and narrated PowerPoint videos on all of these. So you can avail yourself to those if you like. This was if you'll remember me talking about flooding and an implosion. Flooding and implosion evolved into prolonged exposure. It's become a kinder, gentler approach than just dumping in first session your clients into their trauma memories. It now does. There are some kind of four main steps for prolonged exposure that does preparation. So it has lessened significantly the re-traumatization that happened in the early 90s, and it is their retention's a whole lot better. They're not having 50% dropout rates anymore. Still 20 or 25 in the research, and probably a little bit higher than that in practice. But retention is a whole lot better than it was. And so, what is prolonged exposure? Well, the first couple of sessions are obviously assessment is, and I think that they eschew those as including that as part of the treatment, where we have argued that the assessment is part of the treatment. And one of the things that the VA does that Scott Miller has written about that is bad practice, and it's bad practice to have somebody else do intake and then transfer that client to the therapist for therapy. That it's been pretty well demonstrated in the research that the person should start, the consumer should start with their therapist. Their therapist should be doing the intake and the assessment, because that's where the therapeutic relationship gets born. And to sever that, for them to have met the intake specialist and for them to have kind of stepped through all that stuff, and then boop, that relationship's cut off after they've shared all this stuff, and now they got to go do that with somebody else. That you get a lot of dropout in bridging that chasm. So that's a little aside. So the first step of prolonged exposure is education, and it's education about trauma symptoms. It's doing what I was talking with you about in earlier capsules of this, of helping your clients see that their symptoms are normal. This is the way that people that have had experiences that you've had respond to those experiences. This is not pathology. And that the symptoms are resolvable. And when you take the steps that are in front of you of what we're going to do with this treatment, those symptoms are going to dissipate. Educating, I think one of the things that's begun to happen with prolonged exposure is also, it happened less in the 20th century, it's happening more in the past 10 years or so, is also educating trauma survivors of what does recovery look like. You know, and while yes, there is treatment in your future and to address some of the memories and to address the trauma, there's also lifestyle. And that includes diet and exercise and doing healthy things. And so that more and more and more trauma therapists are not just being myopic around the trauma, they're starting to open up and looking at entire lifestyle as part of the therapeutic treatment, and I think that's really important. So educating about all of that. And then teaching clients some relaxation skills, and what prolonged exposure uses primarily has been breathing. What you're seeing now, as I said earlier, is the integration of mindfulness-based stress reduction. So those two are kind of the primary skills that are used in prolonged exposure, is teaching clients diaphragmatic breathing, regulated breathing, structured breathing. You call it a lot of different things, but it's intentional breathing. And then also adding to that package some mindfulness and helping them to begin to dial down their arousal. Relaxation. And then before doing imaginal exposure, before addressing the memory, that what prolonged exposure does is it teaches them to confront. And it's exciting for me now that you're now finally, for a whole lot of years, that the imaginal exposure component of prolonged exposure was to, they talked about how important it was to go into your world and confront the things instead of avoiding the things, and would the prolonged exposure therapist coach would be kind of motivating clients to engage rather than avoid and shut down. But what they didn't do is they did not talk about and support and coach the confronting of those things with a relaxed body. They kind of left it to the client to do it brute force. And when you do it by brute force, you get a whole lot less, usually some. If you're successful at walking through something you're afraid of, then you're going to make a new frame of reference after you've gone through that, and it's going to be less scary for most folks if you're successful with confronting it. But what happens for a lot of clients is they get so scared that they peel off and don't confront it. They don't walk it all the way through. And for folks that have used brute force as a way to try to confront the thing that they're afraid of, you know, flying, and I'm going to do it. And they get to, you know, they get in the jetway and they say, I can't do it because the arousal's gotten so high, and they peel off. Then what happens is they've actually increased the fear. So the next time they try to do it, it's even going to be more than it was previous. So it's just so important that if we're going to do in vivo exposure, if we're going to counsel and coach our clients to confront the things that they're afraid of in the world, is that we teach them first to get and stay in a low energy body so that they're getting the reciprocal inhibition and the desensitization of that process while they're doing that, not doing it with brute force. And I will say that as prolonged exposure has evolved, it has taken a lot more care in adding that component to it. And then finally is imaginal exposure, talking through, of turning the trauma into narrative. And there's different approaches for this with prolonged exposure, but mostly what they do is they have the client pick some of the worst parts of the trauma and rehearse that over and over until there is a dissipation of the intensity. So it is kind of, and initially that was without relaxation. As PE is evolving, it's now with relaxation. So with the relaxation, repeating it over and over, what you're getting is the desensitization process. So you see how prolonged exposure is capturing all of those same active ingredients that we talked about a little bit earlier. That's prolonged exposure. Similar to prolonged exposure, but a little bit more weight on the cognitive end of the spectrum, is cognitive processing therapy, developed by Patty Rezek. Back in the 80s, it was originally developed as a treatment for rape, and it was originally one of the interesting findings that Patty Rezek did. I think she got this would have been the late 80s, she got a pot full of money from the National Institute for Mental Health to explore and test CPT. And originally, she conceptualized it as a journaling, as a written narrative process to help people to help rape survivors resolve the discomfort, the distress, the symptoms associated with rape. And what she did was she had them write a month journaling of the rape experiences. And she did pre and post test and got no significant lessening of symptoms with that post test. And as the story goes, that she then changed her protocol midstream and said, okay, now second phase 2, I'd like for you to find a safe other person to share this with. And what was found was that as the person shared the narrative, shared that writing, they got the relief. And since then, James Pennybaker's work at the University of Texas, what we've learned is that a trauma narrative is not very curative. It doesn't, clients don't get relief from just the construction, from just journaling, just writing about it. There's very little relief achieved. That the relief comes in sharing the experiences with another human being. And I love that. I love that it's a relational process, that the self-help methods, the attempts at self-help of having the person do something on their own to construct that narrative will not resolve the criterion B symptoms, that it needs to be done relationally, that there needs to be coached through the construction of the narrative and then the sharing of it. So where prolonged exposure is a little bit, you saw it could be anywhere from 8 to 15 sessions. Cognitive processing therapy is always 12 or 13 sessions. Always. That's the structure. It is a very structured protocol. 12 sessions if there is no loss or bereavement, 13 sessions if there's loss and bereavement. And each session is scripted and manualized, and so each session has, and while there is some latitude in each of those sessions for the ways that the client kind of brings forward the material, it always is framed up with this particular intention in each session. And here's what those sessions look like. The first one is introduction and education, and almost immediately, I think it's after the first session, that the therapist gives, there's homework between each of the sessions, and the very first thing that the cognitive processing therapist does with the client is have them write an impact statement of best they can to describe what happened, and less about the details of the trauma, but more about the way that trauma has impacted you, of the way it's impacted you physically, the way it's impacted you emotionally, the way it's impacted you relationally, the way that this experience changed your perception, your behaviors, your feelings. And then the session is the processing of the meaning of that event, and then beginning to identify the cognitive processing therapy. And I think, remember when we talked about the DSM, that I told you that there's a lot more weight placed upon the perceptual sequelae of trauma, of PTSD, with the DSM-5 than there has been with any other previous iterations of the DSM. And I think that's primarily because of cognitive processing therapy. because that's what CPT does a lot, is really work on re-scripting, cognitive restructuring around the meanings that a person makes after the trauma. And it digs into helping the person find how they are generalizing about themselves and the world as a result of this trauma in their lives, and then beginning to challenge those in a gentle and relational way, challenge those perceptions, and begin to set up experiments like in the as I talked about in the CBT, to go test those, to use Stoic philosophy to see if this really is factual, or is this a distorted perception, and then helping them to evolve to more reality-based, sensory-based, rather than perceptual-based reasoning and understanding of their world and the traumatic event. And a big part of cognitive processing therapy is to find, and this is kind of two pieces that are subtle. Stuck points during the event of where the person can't get fully narrated the event, and then specifically also stuck points in their life. What is it? And a good way of describing that from the way that we've done this in this course is, where is the space continuing to collapse and that they are repeating the same behaviors. The places where they can't get through, and then beginning to open that up and identify those places of where they are in violation of who and how they want to be, and they find themselves unable to change that, and then starting to build some questions that unpack it and look at what Aaron Beck called the schema, the structural belief system that's underneath of that, and beginning to dismantle that and change that is what's going on primarily with cognitive processing therapy. And you can see in those sessions 5, 6, 7 is really looking at those distorted perceptions and beginning to re-script those. And then sessions 8 through 12 are really looking at specific areas of a person's life, the way that the trauma has impacted that. And so there are questions and structured kind of interview and engagement in session 8 on safety, session 9 on trust, session 10 power and control issues, session 11 self-efficacy and self-esteem, and then session 12 is looking at the way that the trauma has impacted intimacy and beginning to script and challenge how that wants to be. So that's a nice, simple overview of a 300-page treatment manual. And I will say finally that cognitive processing therapy is the SAMHSA-approved evidence-based treatment for combat trauma. It is what is used in the VA to treat combat trauma.